inside the YourTV studios in downtown Belleville for a special post-federal election edition of Your Vote. I'm Zach McGibbon. Alongside me, of course, the legend around here in downtown Belleville. It's Richard Hughes. I know that might be news to you, but a lot of people in the community certainly view you as such. And it's been an interesting election, to say the least, as we're kind of recording here. Still a couple of numbers rolling in, but at least for our area, we'll start off with the Bay of Quinte Riding here, Richard, in terms of how it's looking. We obviously saw the last couple of years it was Ryan Williams, but we have a new winner, a new Bay of Quinte elect coming into the Bay of Quinte Riding. Yes, indeed.
The Bay of Quinte Riding actually is a very interesting history because it has moved back and forth. Some ridings remain liberal or remain conservative or NDP for long periods of time, but not the Bay of Quinte. If you look back even a few years, 2019, Neil Ellis won it for the Liberals, and Tim Durkin was the candidate for the Conservatives at that time. And then in 2021, the next election after that, Ryan Williams won for the Conservatives over Neil Ellis, who was the incumbent at that time. And then, of course, we move up to last night and yesterday when we were all out busy voting and waiting till 9:30 at night to watch the results coming in on the television. Actually, it was more towards midnight, I think, when I gave up on it. But the riding has changed hands from the Conservatives under Ryan Williams to Chris Millett of the Liberals, and he won rather handily with more than 50% of the vote, to 32,000 and a few extras, while Ryan Williams picked up 44% at about 28,000. The NDP, Kate Carruthers and Erica Charlton of the Greens, they ran, as in many other ridings, quite a distance behind. The NDP picked up 2,300 votes and the Green Party 818. But as I say, it was the morning after the night before. We have a new member of Parliament elect in the person of Chris Millett, and we're happy to have him with us here today.
Yeah, that's right. Joining us in studio, Chris Millett. He has been, going around town, talking to different outlets. It's been quite the last couple of hours for you, Mr. Millett. Thank you so much for your time. And I guess, how are you feeling? I know that you were telling us before we were going on air that you're kind of running on a few hours of sleep. How is it kind of settling at this point?
Well, thanks for having me, and Richard and Alan. I'm running on fumes. I've said that, and I wish this was coffee, but it's water. I might need it to keep me awake for the end, but it's been quite a surprise, and quite frankly, it was a long night. The returns were coming in agonizingly slow. The race was fairly close all through the night, and then I guess when they broke into the advanced polls, the numbers just went where they went, and quite solidly at about 1:30, 2 o'clock-ish, I guess it was. CTV called the winner, called us, I guess Toronto Star called it before, and we took that as our win, and it was a joyful room down at Sans Souci down Front Street.
I could tell you just from covering it yesterday, it was.
Yeah, you were there for the fun and frolic, if you will. Yeah.
Oh yeah, especially right at the start. We had some interesting, let's call them bystanders, come by and let their opinions be known on what's going on. But
I arrived just as the eggs flew, but
yeah
I'm glad
I was able to avoid Egggate or whatever we're going to be calling it here.
I'm glad I missed it.
Something else there.
Yes. Well, Chris, of course, you're no stranger to campaigns from your experience on city council. You're no stranger to the political processes at the municipal level. But there'll be quite a few challenges. You've knocked on a lot of doors over the last month. What have you been hearing?
Well, that's and that, Richard, thank you. That was we just blitzed the region. We had a small team. We hit the ground running, but we hit the ground late, as anybody will recall. It should have been about a 5-week campaign. We had barely 4 because. For whatever reason, the Liberal Party of Canada's candidate vetting system was a little bit mired We were told it was quote unquote an embarrassment of riches. That's the way they wanted to put it. But regardless, my name was not released as a confirmed candidate until I believe it was the Thursday of the first week of the campaign. That said, we came together with an amazing group of volunteers. When the call went out for volunteers, the floodgates opened. People just, as Richard said, I'd been around a lot of campaigns. I covered them for 30-some years at the Intel, all municipal, federal, provincial, and I'd seen them, you know, some ragtag, some really slick, some very, very well-oiled machines. I'd say we were somewhere in the middle of that when we started. But, you know, I'll tell you, the dedication, we hit the ground. And what we were finding at the doors, to answer your question, was a real fear of, and it was an overriding fear of, and, you know, we'd been accused of overplaying the Trump card, if you will, pardon the pun. But Donald Trump really has and had and still has people worried to the point where it came down to a question of leadership. And we were prepared. I mean, I had a couple on our campaign team who just crunched me on all of the policy, all of the issues, affordability, housing affordability, energy, on and on and on, military spending, care for seniors, health. When we got to the door, it really came down to a question of leadership. Who did people trust most to handle the threat from Donald Trump and what's happening now with the tariffs and the economic tumult that we're facing? So, you know, it became a question of that at the doors. Now, sure, there were other issues, but that was the overriding issues at the door. We still had great conversations about the important issues, housing affordability and on and on. And you know, a Liberal government under Mark Carney has good plans for all of that, and we can't wait to unroll them. But again, getting back to that, number one question at the door was leadership.
And we have up on our screen here, obviously, the vote totals that you're able to gather, but I noted as well, there's obviously the 28,000 votes there for Ryan Williams. And
yep.
So how do you try to appeal to those voters that didn't vote for you, and what can you say to them, you know, the day after the election, how you are going to be able to lead and try and gain their trust in the riding?
Well, 28, and it's no small number. That you know, I mean, despite the fact that we won in terms of elections, quite handily in terms of the separation between us, 28,626 people felt otherwise, felt that their party the party they supported had better plans. I'm very much about, and I learned this through 6 years on city council, coalition, coming to solutions through coalition. I would much rather see consensus, and I think the Canadian electorate right now is starving for consensus governance. And that's where we're at right now. So those 28,000 people, I think at first there's a fair amount of distrust because let's face it, the Liberals have been ruling now for 10 years. We now have to convince them, and I believe Mark Carney will do so in no short order, that this is a different, and I use the analogy of building a new house that Mark Carney is planning to build. And it's not just put a new board or two in the fence and repaint the front door and call it a new house. Right. There really is an economic plan for building a new house for Canada. And that's where we've got to go. I'm just hoping that the followers that cast their vote for the others would give us a chance. I know that, you know, the runway's fairly short. They want to see results soon, but I believe we can do it, and we're going to hit the ground running.
Well, picking up on that point, that there are 28,000 people who you know, didn't vote for you. In fact, there's over 30,000 who didn't vote for you. But how do you communicate with them? Communication is critical because even in listening to I was listening to the radio this morning, some of the discussions, and some of the supporters of the Conservatives were rather strong in their views, rather firm. How do you communicate with the rest of the population?
Well, we've found that, and I found that some of those Conservative supporters are rather firm in their resolve, and all I can do is ask them to please have an open mind, open up. We have to open up dialogue. Again, I go back to, I think Canadians are tired of seeing two parties stand apart in the House of Commons, howling at each other, not coming to consensus. If you talk to any MP, however, Neil Ellis, Ryan himself will tell you, when you get into committee where the real rubber hits the road and all parties are working on committee, in many, well, I shouldn't say in most cases, but in many cases, and it happens. You know, it doesn't get any headlines, but there is consensus and policy moves forward. One side gives to the other makes suggestions. You know, if we'll meet you here, you'll meet us there. That's the kind of consensus building we have to do. And again, I'm all for that. I think any of our, what I've heard, certainly in speaking with Mr. Carney, he's all for that. He really, really abhors, because the man's an economic, I don't want to say a wizard, but I mean, he's a very, very intelligent man. He's got a job to do. He doesn't want to have to be kind of, you know, in the weeds with infighting or internecine fighting between the parties. That doesn't accomplish anything when we have such serious and heavy lifting to do. So, you know, I'm all for consensus building, and I'm hoping that again we can do that. And there are commonalities. I'm sorry, in some of our platforms. Some of the more, you know, some of the social and other issues that are out there may need a little more work when we get together on them. But I think in the common good of the country and in fighting the tariffs and uniting as a country, we've seen already Mr. Carney's brought together all the premiers and, you know, gotten consensus on that. We are going to tear down some interprovincial barriers. We've got to start working among ourselves as opposed to against each other with as what we've seen is now going to be an economic common enemy to the south. So.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point to end in terms of getting that message out to people that might be tuning in and wanting to know more. So thank you so much for your time, Chris. Again, I know you're a busy man. You've been going around town all day long and
I've been running on fumes.
But congratulations on being elected, and hopefully the trip up to Ottawa ain't too bad.
Well, it's a crash course, I'm told, next week. So
Next week.
Drinking from a fire hose, if you will. Thanks, gentlemen.
Thank you, Chris. We're going to take a break. We'll be back with more of Your Vote here on YourTV Quinte. Welcome back inside the YourTV Quinte studios here in downtown Belleville for a special edition of Your Vote, the post-federal election. I'm Zach McGibbon. Alongside me is Richard Hughes. Just earlier, we had Chris Smollett, the new Bay of Quinte MP-elect for our region. A very tired man, that's Chris Smollett, as he continues to make his way down the region. But it was great to have him on and chat and just kind of get an understanding of how he's feeling, you know, a day out after the polls project him to get the victory there. Our next guest should mention as we approach here, and then we'll get back to Richard in terms of some of the numbers. Some of our analysts that are here for us this afternoon. First is former Mayor of Belleville, Tasso Christopher.
Thank you
and
very
of course our strategist here, Mitch Heimpel. And always a pleasure to have you on for the program. And before we get to you, we'll quickly go into Northumberland-Clarke. Yes. And look at some of the results there, Richard.
That's right. Yes. Before we enter into discussions, Northumberland-Clarke, which of course was created for this election from Northumberland, Peterborough South. But Philip Lawrence, the Conservative, has a fairly long record there now. Back in 2021, he won it rather handily over the Liberals. He had 44%, and this election he did even better. Philip Lawrence, 32,000 votes, 49, almost 50% of the vote. So he did very, very well in that election and in the previous one. So you could say Northumberland-Clarke is a fairly solid Conservative territory. Yeah. Now the other riding that is our neighbours here in in Bay of Quinte is, of course, Hastings, Lennox and Addington-Tyendinaga, with, of course, Tyendinaga being added for this election in the adjustment. And here, Shelby Cramp-Newman won again rather handily over her Liberal opponent, Tracy Sweeney-Shank. And again, Shelby picked up 54%, which is a very solid, a very substantial vote, almost 10,000 more than the next. So again, that riding, which goes far into the north, it's an amazing riding right up into Hastings Highland, right from the Bay of Quinte to Hastings Highlands. It's a very large one. I'm not sure how Shelby covered it all. There's a lot of mileage, and I think in talking to her once, she commented that the time and the mileage is substantial in her riding. But she's carried on tradition. Of course, she comes from a very political family. Her father, Darrell Cramp, was extremely well known and much loved during his time in both federal and provincial politics. But so both Bay of Quinte riding with Chris Millett, as we've just discussed, successful. He's flanked by two other ridings held by the Conservatives. So that's the way we're going to head into the next Parliament.
Yeah, and those are two ridings that are pretty new in terms of this federal election. Obviously, adding Tyendinaga to Hastings Lennox Addington. Now you got Northumberland-Clarke. Mitchell, kind of start with you on this one. With these kind of new ridings, how does the strategy change for any of the candidates in those areas in terms of trying to campaign and trying to reach out to new voters? Because I would imagine they have to go to different areas to try and reach to voters they might not have had to reach before.
Well, so in Shelby's case, she's adding the northern part of Sydney Township to her riding. That's adding a few thousand voters. I think the margin was actually pretty good for her. In the 2021 election, Ryan won that part of the riding by 700 votes, 1,000 votes. It was pretty good. But as was kind of noted, you've got to get in there, you've got to get vote ID'd, you've got to get your candidate better known. That's not a huge change to her riding. As Richard was kind of pointing out, her riding kind of stretches from almost Algonquin Park all the way down to the Kingston suburbs, which is quite a bit of geography to cover. In Phil Lawrence's case, his riding lost municipalities. It lost two former townships in Peterborough County, but it didn't really gain anything. And so in most of that riding, and that's partly due to population growth, or almost entirely due to population growth. So Phil didn't have a big change to his riding other than what he lost. All the people voting for him had him as their MP for the last 6 years.
Sure. And Tasso, as you kind of looked at the ridings, was there anything that kind of stuck out to you in any of the two ridings in Northumberland-Clarke, Hastings Lennox Addington-Tyendinaga?
Thank you for the question. I think the good thing is we had good voter turnout, which is important in every level of governance, in every level of elections, from the municipal to provincial and federal, which is really good to see. I was talking off the screen with Mitch, and I think we were high 60%, which is really nice to see. You get the community involved, they get engaged, you get different generations involved. And being an elected official, you want democracy to be exercised, and it was good that the candidates, they got to the doors. It's a lot of work. He's bang on. There's a lot of area to cover. In a municipality, it's condensed. But when you talk rural areas like Shelby, she's got a big area. It's got to be a 2.5, 3 hour drive from one to the other. Oh
yeah, if you wanted to get from Amherst View all the way up to Lake St. Peter, and there's no 100-mile-an-hour road that gets you there.
Right? Exactly, and it's a lot of pressure on the candidates. And when you want to hold a little public meeting and you take a 3 hour drive and make 6 people show up, you just got to grind away and make sure that the people know that you want to make a difference for them and for the riding and for the party.
Yeah, I want to kind of dive a little bit deeper on that, since you are somebody that's gone to the doors, obviously on a local level in terms of reaching it, but obviously when you have that massive reach that you've got to reach the voters, I imagine that's a bit tougher, as you mentioned, with the lawn trips down the road. It could be 3-4 hours.
Oh, huge! And every election changes, and every level changes. Again, from municipal to provincial to federal. The old book of running an election, you got to revamp it. Things have changed. Social media has changed. Marketing has changed. Advertising has changed. The economic component has changed. You want to have a team. Mr. Millett commented about having a vibrant, small team, but there's only so many volunteers. So you have to have a plan. I take my hat off to all the candidates, as I said in the past, that even put their name on on a docket. It's very important, and they should be tremendously proud. They had an opportunity to represent Canada, which is the greatest country in the world. So in that case there, they've done a good job. And the ones that are successful, congrats to all of them.
Absolutely.
Yeah. There's something I noticed in looking at both Northumberland-Clarke and Hastings Lennox Addington-Tyendinaga. There are no cities in those two ridings. Yet in Bay of Quinte we have two cities. Is it traditional that the rural vote leans towards Conservatives?
So yes, John Goheen got very close to Phil Lawrence for that riding. Like, there's about a 3,000 vote spread there. What would have happened in Northumberland if the kind of similar dynamic will play out? I would imagine, and we'll know this better when we get polls, poll by polls, which should be released in about 6 weeks. I would bet you Goheen did fairly well in Port Hope. Probably did okay in Coburg. And what happened is, in some of those rural polls out in Codrington or Baltimore or Grafton or something, like, Phil just ran up the score on him, and that would have provided a large amount of his win. The same thing would have happened with Shelby. I know when I worked for Todd Smith provincially, we used to joke that the polls in Springbrook were so blue they were black.
Right.
And so you could the joke is there are some places in the country where they don't count the Conservative vote, they weigh it.
Yeah.
And so you get some of that across big rural ridings like that.
And I imagine, we've seen just, obviously, Mark Carney, as we're recording, projected to get the government here. How do you kind of look at the Liberal performances? I can lay it up for either Tasso or Mitch on this one, but you kind of mentioned with the rural areas, especially in those two ridings we were talking about there with Northumberland-Clarke, Hastings Lennox Addington-Tyendinaga. That's a bit of a mouthful, eh? But that's a new riding. Maybe want to try and condense those. But in terms of, you kind of mentioned there with John Goheen and how he was able to kind of reach, how do you kind of look at that Liberal performance in those areas?
It's difficult to take anything out of the Liberal performance last night because they're the government this morning.
Right.
That's being driven a lot by performance in 416, performance in urban Montreal. Suburban Montreal actually came in very big for the Liberals, where they have a lot of battleground ridings with the Bloc Québécois. That was huge for them last night. Holding those two bastions were essential to them, and then Greater Vancouver as well. The other thing that is the story, Richard kind of talked about this in the first segment a little bit, the NDP got eliminated from the electoral map across huge swaths of the country last night. And so we can dig into that a little more, but that was instrumental in the Liberal vote share. The NDP won, the Liberals won Hamilton Centre, which nobody was expecting at the start of the night last night. But it turns out to be essential to the Liberals forming government.
Yes, on that, again, in looking at these two neighbouring ridings here, if you take the Liberal vote and the Conservative vote in both of them, all of the other parties, and there were, 4 others in Northumberland, there were 3 others in Hastings, Lennox, and Addington, they are miles behind.
Yeah.
They're miles behind. Is this pointing to the future? Are we going to move more and more towards a two-party system with a,
I think the NDP has real soul searching to do after last night. For a long time, they tried to be kind of both the party of faculty clubs and like the latest social activist trend, as well as being the party that I don't think a lot of us probably remember, which is union shops and trade floors and things like that. Mm-hmm. And if you look at what happened last night, both of those wings of the NDP abandoned them. The Liberals won those ridings in downtown Vancouver, in downtown Toronto, places like Hamilton Centre, the Liberals were able to take from the NDP. Then the Tories ate the other half. They got the London Fanshaws, Elmwood Transcona, Bill Blakey and J.S. Woodworth's old riding in Winnipeg is a Conservative riding this morning. Both ridings in Windsor are Conservative ridings. That the NDP just got cannibalized from both sides. And there's a real concern, I think, if you're sitting at New Democratic headquarters today, that you're looking at a two-party system going forward because they were not expecting to get as devastated as they got last night.
If I can comment on that, I think the interesting component now, Mr. Hughes mentions about the NDP and Mitch also, it's going to be very interesting in the way the Liberal government or Prime Minister Carney performs. As at the present time during the release, it's 168 to 144. The numbers are approximately. The odds are pretty good. They're not going to get a majority, but they're going to be a minority. But he still needs to have, he needs to have the votes to get his bills and his resolutions approved on the floor. And, a couple of dynamics may be, as in the NDPs may not even participate at all, so he's going to get the votes. I really hope that they look at getting a lot of cooperation and good dialogue and good correspondence and good information to the floor. So they have good, healthy debate or discussion and get their resolutions or their bills forwarded and passed for the benefit of the entire nation. That's very, very important right now.
For sure. And I think kind of sticking to that topic of like messaging and trying to get a message across, we're going to play some of the closing statements from the debates. We'll first start off with Chris Millette and his closing statement.
Statements, you will have 2 minutes. I would like to invite Chris Millette for his closing statement. Chris?
Thanks, Chris. Listen, I'm probably an unlikely federal candidate. I'm built like a beer keg. I got face like 5 miles of bad road. But I'll tell you what I do have. I have heart, drive, and a deep understanding of the people of the Bay of Quinte. I want to thank you all tonight for coming out, and we are blessed to live in one of the greatest countries on the planet. Canada is one of the most admired, most progressive and prosperous countries in the world. Let's not forget that. We live in a time of immense challenges, however, and through that fire we are forging an opportunity to build one of the strongest, most free and caring nations, which is bestowed with natural riches, resources, and a nation's story like no other. Under the leadership of Mark Carney, we'll face those challenges such as tariffs, housing, climate change, building new infrastructure, healthcare, and among others, rebuilding of our military. Now is not the time to tear it all down with three-word slogans and bumper sticker populist politics. Now's the time to rally around our maple leaf, to get our elbows up and support our leader, Mark Carney, to bring us through that tumult, stronger and with an unbreakable resolve to continue as one of the best places on earth in which to live, raise a family, and thrive. Thank you very much for your time tonight.
There from Chris Millette in the closing remarks of that debate, a very raucous debate, I should mention as well, over at the Empire Theatre. And I'll start with you, Tasso, on that. When you kind of look at those closing statements, and as somebody that's had to give speeches before to a crowd, how you kind of look at that and how he was able to kind of get that messaging across, obviously leading to his victory.
Yeah, I mean, his comments were well prepared. I mean, I think the most important thing, if we're flying at, say, 35 or 40,000 feet across the entire nation, the most important thing is our health care. And they touched on it, which was nice, but they should have dived deeper into it. It's unfortunate what's happening in the U.S., but there's always going to be situations that you're not prepared for, and you have to adjust. Again, at any level of government, from municipal to provincial to federal. And they will adjust. They will adapt. They have the right people, and they get some very smart, advised people around them to adjust, unfortunately, the situations that occur with the U.S. The closing remarks were fine. I hope that they stay close to their words, that healthcare will be very, very important across the entire nation, because there is no number 2 and number 3. If we don't have healthcare, again, at the municipal, provincial, federal level, we have a problem. And I hope that stays well. And the other part was the communication flow from our MPs that get elected in our ridings, which is nice. They represent us. They knock on our door. We give them the support. As long as we don't lose track of them and we don't lose touch of them, and they're not told what to do, when to do it, and how to do it, when to put the hand up, when to take the hand down. It's very important going forward in our ridings and in democracy.
And Mitch, what did you kind of take? Well, you were there that night as well. And
I wasn't. I was the provincial one.
Oh, you were the provincial one. That's right.
6 weeks.
They've all blended together.
It's all
right?
one big. It's all one big election at this point. A couple of things I noticed off the top. First, Chris did a really good job at kind of diffusing the audience and kind of being relatable right off the top. That tends to make it easier for people to listen to you for longer periods of time. And we've seen this as attention spans kind of decline. The other thing that he did, which is a little bit of a practiced politician thing, and I'm sure when we look at Ryan's, we'll see a different version of it, is he knew the ballot question in this riding for people who were going to vote Liberal, and we saw this across the country, as voters got older, the concerns about the relationship with the United States, the tariffs, all those things became greater. As voters got younger, their priorities skewed more towards economic growth, affordability, change in government, those narratives. Chris really hit the United States relationship, the tariff relationship, Carney's experience, those key themes he needed to hit the voters that were most accessible to him.
For sure. And we now kind of move on over to the Hastings Lennox Addington-Tyendinaga region. We go look at the conservative wise, and we take a look at the closing statement from Shelby Cramp-Nyman.
Third closing statement, Conservative candidate Shelby Cramp-Nyman. You have 2 minutes starting now.
I'd like to start by giving Canadians a lot of credit. They're more engaged and informed with what's happening in Canada than I recall. This is my 10th federal campaign that I've been involved in, whether it's as a candidate or a campaign manager or a volunteer. In some capacity, campaigns and elections and serving the people of Hastings and Lennox and Addington-Tyendinaga have been a big part of my life. Elections have consequences, and I couldn't agree more that this is a very pivotal election. Sovereignty, safety, affordability, and economic growth. There is no way, in my opinion, that we can afford 4 more years. I'm going to repeat that. There is no way. And I really think, and I know knocking door to door to door, there's a lot of consensus. People are looking for hope. They're looking for change. And there is no way Canada can afford a 4th Liberal government. At this stage of the game, we're 2.5 weeks out. We're midway of the campaign, and voting cards are starting to arrive in the mail. I encourage people to be mindful of where you're voting. The voting locations, some of them have changed. Respectfully and with humility, I ask for your support, because right now I think humility is a lost art, and I will earn your respect. If you have questions, please, I invite you to ask them. Obviously, this is not the forum where you ask questions, but whether it's via email or coming by my office, I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Final
Comments there from Shelby Cramp-Nyman. We'll go to Mitch to start on that. So obviously different messaging than what we see from Chris Millette. So what was your kind of analysis from that?
So, unsurprisingly for Shelby, she really leaned into her personal connection to the riding, especially at the end of her speech. But a little bit of what we were talking about before, her narrative was much more change in government focused, which we probably would have heard from conservatives across the country. And that gets into, again, the voter, this was really, for the first time in my life that I can remember, an election of 2 predominantly different ballot questions. And a segment of voters was really engaged on, we need a change in government, we need to tackle an affordability crisis, we need to stimulate economic growth, the country has to be more productive. And the other side of the country was very tied into our sovereignty is at stake, our relationship with the United States is a mess, these tariffs are damaging the economy, they're killing my retirement savings, things like that. And so what you cared about always determines who you were going to vote for, but we've rarely seen it just divide the electorate in half like this. And that's reflected in both of these closing statements.
Tasso, your thoughts on those
Yeah,
statements?
thank you. Shelby stayed really high level. I mean, and her riding is mostly, as we talked earlier, rural farming communities. Not a lot, if any, municipalities, a couple of small little hamlets. So she stayed high level. Her presentation was very good. She's very compassionate, she's very loyal, and she's very passionate about the role she has as a representative for the country of Canada. And she actually she knows her audience. She's been in the system, I think, an elected official close to 10 years, which she should be, and her family should be tremendously proud. So she knows her audience, she knows her constituents, and she did a very nice job in her closing statements. But I must say, people in the rural environments, excuse me, still have concerns about healthcare. So we can't miss that point. That it is the most important thing that's before us right now at every level of government. Her closing remarks, they were bang on for her constituents, and it looked like it was a good return on that investment too.
For sure. Obviously, getting her the victory in that riding. And we'll look at the last riding that we cover here with Northumberland-Clarke, and we'll take a look at the closing statements there.
Over the past 10 years, we've seen many challenges facing Canadians. It's been difficult times. We've had the lowest GDP per capita, our economy, since the Great Depression. We've seen housing costs that have doubled. I've talked to numerous neighbors who have relatively good jobs but can't afford to make ends meet and are facing bankruptcy. We've seen businesses leave our country. We've seen businesses leave our community, like Post. I believe that Canada has an opportunity, in fact, a Canadian government has an obligation to do better. I believe that we can return to a Canada where housing is affordable, where an entire generation of young people haven't given up the dream of home ownership, where that everyone has a legitimate opportunity to get a great job or to start a new business, where we get our energy out of the ground, lifting the prosperity and fixing our financial situation, where we no longer have a deficit where we pay more in interest than we do in healthcare. If you believe, as I do, that the Canadian government should do better, that it can do better, please consider voting Philip Lawrence and the Conservative Party on April 28th.
Thank you very much, Philip. And
Lawrence, I'll go back to you, Tasso, just kind of analyzing it. A little similar to Shelby Cramp-Nyman's messaging, but...
So just refresh my memory, is this a new riding we have now?
No, it's mostly the old Northumberland ride.
Gotcha,
Yeah.
okay, yeah. So it's nice that he touched on healthcare, and again, it comes back to he knows his constituents. I don't really think there's a large municipalities, a couple of small hamlets in there, and the municipal councils do a phenomenal job with what resources they get from the federal level. But again, very passionate individual, knows the constituent and sends the message. I'm very happy that he touched on healthcare, and again, his message was successful because he made it through also the System A, so it worked out well for him.
Absolutely. Mitch, your thoughts?
A lot of the same themes. You know, we need a change in government, we have an affordability problem, we have an economic growth problem. Like, this was very much what you would want a Conservative candidate to hit on if you're running the Conservative Central campaign. Obviously, there's usually a bit of a question during campaigns about whether parties want local candidates doing debates. It was good to see everybody did them this time. But it was very close to the messaging that the Central Party would have expected their candidates to be carrying for what they wanted the ballot question to be.
For sure. With that, we'll take a quick commercial break. When we come back, we'll wrap up our post-federal election coverage. You're watching a special edition of Your Vote, the post-federal election edition, here on YourTV Quinte. Welcome back inside the YourTV Quinte studios in downtown Belleville. Zach McGibbon alongside me is Richard Hughes as we continue along with this Your Vote special edition of the post-federal election. And Richard, obviously we've been able to get through a bunch of different ridings. We had the chance to talk with Chris Billette earlier in the hour, then obviously broke down everything in each riding, and now just kind of looking at a couple of different general topics.
Well, that's right. I'd suggest, you know, we've looked at the micro situation, the ridings close to us. Let's take a look at the national situation, because the Conservative Party is certainly not feeling good today. They're disappointed with the loss, but you have to recognize the Conservatives gained 25 seats in this election. The Liberals gained 8, so there was a very positive result for the Conservative government, not Conservative Party, not sufficient to overturn things, but that has to be looked on in a very positive way.
Right now, I don't think Conservatives feel as bad as they thought they might this morning. That gain of 25 seats, they overperformed the polls in the province of Ontario from what they were expecting. The Conservatives got 45% of the vote in Ontario, which is 2% more than Doug Ford got in the provincial election 6 weeks ago. So that's quite good. 42% nationally would have been good enough to form a government in every election in the last 40 years, except for this one. So you look at that and you go, like, there's a lot to be happy about. The wins in places Conservatives haven't won since John Diefenbaker was Prime Minister. I was talking about like Windsor earlier. There's a few of those that I think they're also pretty happy with. At the same time, minority government, we could all be back at this again in 2 years.
And Tasso, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I fully support that. It'd be interesting to find out as things roll out that these numbers, obviously it's either fortunate or unfortunate. The NDP obviously lost some seats there, and they've been shifted. Most of them obviously went to the Conservative Party, the balance went to the Liberals. But it'd also be nice to know with the large voter turnout, the generation that came out, the youth, if they participated, and what do we classify as youth now? Is it like 18 to 25, or is it 25 to 40, or is it, you don't even know? But I would really hope, as everything rolls out and the data comes through and the statistics come forward, we start to see a younger generation involved that participate, that actually supported more seats for the Conservative rather than the Liberals. So we'll get a flavor of what's going on future-wise.
Yes. Well, I've got, as Mr. Mitch was commenting, it's a couple of weeks we get the details, the finer details of the polling and other things. But it's interesting, Atlantic Canada, there was a shift of one seat. One seat, wow. And even in the prairies, it was very small. The traditional votes, they stayed where they were. I think the Conservatives gained 14 seats in Ontario.
Yes.
And that has to be encouraging and as they move forward.
And to Tasso's point about, we don't actually need the poll by polls to tell us a bit of what happened generationally. We saw the Conservatives lose ridings where we have a larger boomer population. If you think about here in Bay of Quinte, if you think about just up Highway 62 and a little over on Highway 7 there in Peterborough, we saw ridings where there were Conservative MPs prior to this election. There no longer are. At the same time, you look at some of those bedroom communities around Toronto, Brampton West, a good example, Milton, though they had ridings that fell to the Conservatives. The entirety of Waterloo region, except for the older riding of Kitchener-Conestoga, which has Elmira and St. Jacobs and some of these places in it, fell to the Conservatives last night. So we can see from kind of the riding by riding demographics that as the population got older in some of these ridings, we got more swinging toward the red side of the fence. If things got a little more suburban, they got a little younger, we saw a drift toward the blue team. So that bearing itself out across the whole country got you a lot of the results you got.
It'll be interesting now as the strategists in both parties, they look at this data and hopefully they build on it. Very high level, as Mitch mentioned. Hopefully they get that information and they start to build on it. Because there's an end date for the generation above us. They have to start looking at the youth and starting getting them engaged and getting them involved, because at the end of the day, they're the ones who are going to be voting.
Yeah. There's one thing, again, looking at the national picture, there's something I don't think I've ever seen in my lifetime is two party leaders losing their seats.
Yes,
that's one.
And that's rather surprising on both counts, but where does that leave those two parties?
So Jagmeet Singh has stated last night, I think it was actually around the same time as CTV called Bay of Quinte. So in the Lauren Brooker studio, we were talking about that and not Jagmeet Singh resigning. But Jagmeet Singh has resigned. This was his third election at the helm of the NDP. They lost seats the first time. They were flat the second time. They bombed out of party status this time, so he's done. The NDP will initiate a leadership process. I expect that will take probably 6 months to a year. Given the amount of the limited resources they have now, probably closer to 6 months. The Conservatives, it's unusual for a leader to not have a seat, but it's not unheard of. Obviously, Mark Carney was Prime Minister without a seat for a couple of weeks there. Stephen Harper, when he became leader of the United Conservative Party, or leader of the Canadian Alliance, he didn't have a seat. He ended up running in a by-election in Calgary Southeast. There's like Brian Mulrooney, when he became leader of the Progressive Conservatives in 1983, didn't have a seat. Elmer MacKay had to step down. Jean Chrétien, when he re-entered the House of Commons in 1990. So this happens. I would expect a Conservative, probably somewhere out in the rural West, is going to be asked very nicely to allow the leader to enter the House of Commons in a riding where, again, the Conservative vote is likely quite substantial, and we'll see that play out that way.
Tasso, your thoughts?
Yeah, well, my opinion would be, and Mitch would have much more experience and history on me on this, but I would look at an individual that went through a democratic process that lost their seat, lost their position, was not elected in. as in the leader of the NDP, publicly commented and said, you know what, it's time for me to go. And Mitch is banging on, they're going to go through a process, probably a convention process, and elect or appoint a leader. And also the Conservative leader, same idea, went through a democratic process, very unfortunate that didn't get elected, but there is a system in our governance that allows that individual to have an opportunity to have a seat. Now, hopefully there's a mechanism in there that they'll contact an individual that's successful in this election, as Mitch mentions, and maybe, vacate their seat, have a by-election, and give them opportunity. It'd be interesting, because that individual, whoever they go to, just went through a democratic process of campaigning and running and knocking on doors and was successful. So it's an interesting situation, as Mr. Hughes brings up, that we have two leaders with no seats.
One question I wanted to ask you, because obviously there's been talk about tariffs. We've been hearing about Donald Trump, but one of the other issues I've noticed with a lot of the parties that they were really going after was housing. Yeah. And housing being such a big topic. You were talking a little bit earlier, Tasso, about trying to engage with the youth. You hear with youth trying to buying a home is near impossible nowadays. Now that you have these local members of government that are now elected in, Tasso, I'll start with you, since you obviously kind of oversee it from the municipal level, but how can all three levels of government, from the province to the feds to municipally, be able to work together, especially like in our area, we have an MPP that's conservative and an MP that's liberal?
Very good point. Now, I was going to bring it up earlier. So we have a liberal MP, and the unique situation is when the government of the day adjusted the boundaries, and municipalities were cut in half. Some were cut in a third. So, for instance, Belleville. I can only comment on Belleville. We're from, at the federal level, provincial level, 401 down, approximately 401 down is Hastings and Prince Edward, which we have a liberal representative sitting in the House. And now north of 401, which is still is Belleville, which we call our third ward. Now we have a representative on the Conservative seat. It's a unique dynamic. So as a municipal leader, you need to bring them both in. And as a municipal leader, you need to have open communication and make sure that they have open communication and make sure that they go to the government of the day and say, we need this type of support. And then to roll out into projects. The biggest one of all is healthcare and infrastructure. And then the other ones fall into the queue. And home affordability and social programs is just as important. But they've got to, the individual that has a municipality that's split in two, has to find the common ground in communication to bring his MPs together and say, we need to have a voice in Ottawa, and this is what we need.
And Mitch, your thoughts on that?
There's been a lot of focus in both the federal and provincial level on the role development charges play in getting housing built. Not so much here in Belleville, but certainly in Mississauga, Toronto, some of the other large municipalities in the province of Ontario, there is a view that development charges are essentially preemptive property taxes, and that's how they're being imposed. They're not just covering the development of a condo tower, a triplex, a subdivision anymore. They're essentially a tax on home ownership. That is because in those particular municipalities, development charges are ridiculous. They're astronomically high. That's not as much the case here, but what you're seeing governments talk about both federally and provincially is there a way we can use the purse strings, the power of federal money, grants, whatever, to convince municipalities that you only qualify for certain programs if you bring DCs down. I don't know the extent to which that's going to be something that Mark Carney pursues as Prime Minister. He's also talked about, making it easier for prefabricated homes to get built. Some of the post-war housing plans that they brought in are under discussion, but it's something that if you don't see movement on, you will continue to see an active youth participation on.
Yeah, and so we're starting to wrap it up here on our post-election coverage, but I'll give you the floor, just a quick 30 seconds thoughts on how you just kind of viewed the election. First, I'll start with you, Mitch.
I'm really interested, we talked about this quite a bit, in what happens going forward. Is this a total change election in the sense of, are we back to a two-party system? Which we haven't been in Canada since 1958. Like last night, the two parties got 85% of the vote. The last time that happened was the year my father was born. If we're back to that, that fundamentally changes the map. It changes the voters that every party's chasing, and it changes everybody's electoral coalitions. And that's not something we're used to.
Tasso, your thoughts?
Thank you. I really hope that that they start looking at getting the youth involved and engaged. I really think that's important. I hope both parties finally realize that healthcare is a problem. And I know I'm going on and on, but it's very important. It's the number one thing in our country. They need that, and they got to get the youth involved. And I think it's good. This would be very interesting. I truly hope our government of the day looks at the rule books of the past and says, we need to tweak, we need to adjust, we need to change. You know, you can't keep going with the same manual that's 40 years old. And I'll give you just a fundamental example. When you buy a brand new car, you open up the glove compartment, the manual doesn't say 1969. It says 2024. Right. And, you know, and government needs to adjust, and they need to look at what's ahead of us and get ahead of the curve. They need to get the youth engaged, and also they need to trickle that all the way down to our education system and start having civics again and getting kids involved so they know what's going on, so they can have good dialogue with guys like Mitch that has the data and the technical information, so we get them involved. Going forward, it'll be very interesting. It's going to be a two-party government.
Yeah, it's certainly something that we've been learning over the last little bit, but thank you so much, Mitch Heimpel, Tasso Christopher, and of course Richard Hughes for joining me on the sets as well on this special post-federal election edition of Your Votes. Quite the interesting election, to say the least, as we've been able to break down in the last hour. So thank you everybody that was able to tune in from the downtown Belleville studios of YourTV Quinte. I'm Zach McGibbon for Richard Hughes, for Mitch Heimpel, for Tasso Christopher. We'll see you in the future.